And no wonder, for Satan himself transfigures himself into an angel of light. The trope of villainy is undeniably fundamental to successful storytelling because it makes it realistic by reflecting the workings of life itself. The push-off challenge against the comfort of peace, the suffering inextricably linked to well-being, is the actor that introduces order into chaos, or rather, paradoxically, chaos itself challenges itself into order. What would become unease and boredom of peace is extracted from the realm of possibility it represents, thanks to this push and pull. This is the idea the hero-villain relationship and the concept of hero journey are themselves based on. This process is, above all, an internal psychic process that was first extrapolated onto religion and myth, and later manifested in culture, and even helped shape the laws of a civilized society. It may remain unnoticed elsewhere, unless taken apart, but its clearest manifestation today takes place in fiction. Part of the reason why today's movies fail to impress is due to the attempt to turn villains into heroes without building an arc that could be logically concluded in such way prior to doing so, or due to merging the differences between the villain and the hero without sense, thus creating blunt, undifferentiated characters. If you watch my video about the woke ideology, it might give you some insight into why movies today are made this way. Star Wars sequels are a very good bad example of how huge of a failure this attempt can turn into. A well-written villain is on par with the hero, and often even above the hero's current ability. He's a tool that drives gestation, subsequent birth, and even growth of the force of order, which the hero embodies or will embody. A good villain is what holds the plot together, because his presence shapes the hero's journey, either directly or indirectly. In the process, the chaotic element the villain represents is struggled against, and, in the end, subjugated or vanquished. Thus, the cycle is begun by the force of evil's birth, and closed by its downfall or disarmament, or, in more sophisticated stories, its integration, diminution, or even victory. Apart from its classical attributes, a force of evil should have perplexity-evoking features, an element of mysteriousness, aloofness, and narcissistic separateness from the world, despite forming just another part of it. For example, Lord of the Rings has Sauron, a mysterious force of evil isolated in its own realm. He's removed from the world of ordinary people, despite having been one of them, but at the same time holds a great sway over them. This is important for creation of a realistic reflection of the worldly phenomena. Evil is something that deviates and brings disorder. It uses trickery and subterfuge. It devours slowly or too fast. It acts unseen or so openly that the forest can't be seen through the trees, and more often than not, it can't be explained away. Even when it strikes hard, right in the face, the victim is staggered, confused. To name a few such accurate representations of evil, I'd certainly have to mention Darth Vader, Joker, or Hannibal Lecter, and the topic of today's video, Griffith. Their behaviour is incomprehensible to the consciousness of the ordinary people that shun atrocious acts, while at the same time they're unconsciously appreciated due to the shared hidden desire to have one's revenge or to use force arbitrarily to get what one wants. This is part of the reason why sociopaths such as Griffith charm and always attract some followers. Griffith, who himself was at first a little nobody and experienced the struggles of ordinary people, at the same time remained removed from them. As we can see, the concept of aboveness or omnipresence mixed with removal of the top from the bottom that will control the bottom arbitrarily as a goal remains preserved. In Griffith, it's emphasized in his portrayal as a bird of prey. He dreams about becoming a bird that floats above the rest of the world. The world lies under its wings, under his control. He oversees everything. Hawks have great eyesight, and there's a huge emphasis paid on his glance. He can prey on or cherish whomsoever he likes. He's seen as a deity, admired and followed, envied or hated but secretly admired, but always as a mysterious painting left behind without a note by a painter who had died centuries ago, untouchable and impossible to comprehend. The surrounding characters see a layer of perfection they can't pervade in any way. Griffith is the Hitler of fiction. Ravings of a charming madman without a soul are venerated as the utmost truth. Even before his ascent, Griffith was always alone in the world, like a force without a match, and we later see how, after God's representation of an opposing force appears in his life, he turns into the force he embodies fully in an enantiodromia, one-sided domination of the singular aspect he represents. Why I think he stands out even amongst the greatest villains is his portrayal not as a villain that represents evil, but as someone who stands beyond good and evil, while at the same time representing the very idea of evil. The true nature of evil lies in intentional, self-willed indifference. We might be inclined to assume that nature is in itself evil because of the indifference towards pain and suffering it's bound to. But chaos is a creative element and is not in itself evil. Only when order governs chaos can it decide to give it either a moral or an immoral glazing, that is, give it a chaotic or an ordered direction, because the act of giving the direction is itself that of order. The state of nature, per se, cannot be considered evil unless it possesses a conscious, self-aware element. Although animals kill each other, they are governed by the state of nature, not by a state of consciousness that decides to engage in violent acts to meet an end that could be met without using violence. For example, animals don't consciously decide to act morally or immorally. They don't appreciate the concepts of good and evil, as these are only realized in a state of self-awareness. They take a life, for example, to survive, to feed their offspring, to reproduce, etc. Humans, however, differentiate between taking a life in self-defense or for survival and between a cold-blooded murder or carelessness of how many lives will be snuffed out in a selfish pursuit of a goal. Griffith is the most veritable depiction of what happens when order is manipulated into self-willed degradation towards chaos or intentional indifference. It's not rage, lust, hatred, or vengeance. It's cold indifference and careless pursuit of a goal, and any tool, whether good or bad, will be utilized to achieve it. Everything in his mind is so neat that it's terrifying. It's a mind so cold that it transcends humanity in its dissimilarity with it. He's Nietzsche's Übermensch, Superman. He's the beast portrayed in the Book of Revelation mistaken for Christ reborn everyone venerates and bows to. He's the Antichrist, the hawk of darkness under the veil of the hawk of light, exactly because he takes order and plunges it into chaos. Before we delve deeper, it's important to understand that Berserk uses many Christian representations of good and inverts them to evil in an attempt to merge the two to synthesize the unity. When I refer to God in this video, it's the depiction of the Christian God, not Berserk's, unless stated otherwise. The embodiment of evil, femto, is reborn through and shares the body with a symbol of purity, an unborn child, the moon boy, who might actually be the true hawk of light. Evil is reborn with good, thus giving rise to a synthesis of opposites, a typically Nietzschean idea. The narrative is turned upside down. The dark and the light are inverted. The apostles are the devil's offspring, and Christ himself is Antichrist. God is represented by the beast, whereas Griffith is the hawk of light. In reality, however, he's the hawk of darkness, the bride Lucifer, a paradox in itself. The name Lucifer can be translated from the Hebrew word Hallel, which means brightness, therefore also the word hell, which is also bright because it's full of fires. Parallels between Lucifer and Griffith are striking, but with a significant twist. Lucifer's story is merged with Christ's. It's, in a sense, what would happen if Christ had the opposite values. Lucifer was first the most perfect of angels, God's favourite, a godlike figure, transcendental, awe-inspiring, both serious and childlike. He was called Samael, the accuser, until he rebelled against God to establish his own kingdom. He then became the Prince of Darkness. Griffith is tortured, and after that, at the apotheosis, the scene in the lake, the moment of revelation, he calls to God, and Behelit opens the heaven. Griffith ushers in the eclipse, dies figuratively, and is raised to heaven, or in other words, becomes the fifth member of the God Hand. Griffith thus dies and is reborn in quote-unquote heaven, and then is reborn on earth, just like Christ. But Antichrist was also reborn. The blind white sheep and the black sheep both follow him, as this is pointed out by Schierke. He is the hawk of darkness who appears to be the hawk of light. Much like Lucifer, Griffith isn't haunted by any tragic backstory. He's always treaded on people without much shame or guilt. They both have always wanted to dethrone God and sit on the throne despite being a most perfect creation. Lucifer's story is that of overdevelopment of the ego and reason. He was destined to rebel because God made him perfect, self-aware, and limited. Whereas God is all-encompassing, Lucifer is a self-aware fragment of perfection contained within a limit. This perfection seeks a way out of finitude, and so does Griffith. But Lucifer's endeavour is doomed to fail from the start. Lucifer doesn't comprehend that he too is subject to God and cannot overcome his finitude through pursuit of something finite. And so he's doomed to be forever unsatisfied. Griffith, if given the freedom to act, will soar forever, with emptiness being his only solace. He will always be like Sisyphus, and his dream will be his tone. Another interesting parallel is that of Lucifer's fall. He falls like lightning from heaven, what in Berserk people see as the descent of the hawk of light, dispersing the darkness, even though he's the cause of it. It all began in the lake, and perhaps it could end there. At the end of the Bible, in the Revelation, it's said that in the end, Christ returns, vanquishes Satan, and he's hurled into the lake of fire for eternity, along with his angels, or demons, and followers. What Mura himself said supports this. He had actually planned an ending that would balance the obscurity of tragedy towards the more positive side. The reason why I like the depiction of this idea is that it simultaneously reflects a phenomenon the society is currently being afflicted by. Jung offered insight as to why this happens, explaining that the monotheistic insistence of Christianity on good eventually led to introjection of evil into man instead of the devil. My take is that since introjection can be dangerous, whether of high ideal or lowliness, because it can overtake the ego, either in the form of narcissism or exaggerated self-mortification, there is an attempt to reproject it after it's been introjected. As such, evil gives a false impression that it's gone, and because of that, it comes to be seen as a misconception of good and a tool of progress. This is related to the means the Nietzschean overman is therefore allowed to utilize. As I mentioned, Griffith is the Nietzschean Superman, a man beyond good and evil. His Apollo, the god of light, beauty and harmony, at most sublime achievements. His opposite is Dionysus, a representation of primitive instincts and urges. The goal of tragedy is reached when the Apollonian and Dionysian principles are united, which happened in Griffith already. This entire Nietzschean idea is, again, a dialectic process that's meant to culminate in the synthesis of the two opposites, creating his Superman or Overman. He's meant to surpass duality, reign it, take it under his control at any cost. However, paradoxically, all he does is that he flops morality on itself. Cold-hearted, animalistic obliviousness of a reign of pure reason. In him, we witness what happens when reason achieves its ultimate manifestation. It reverts back to chaos. That's the limit of duality. So, ironically, all this does is that it enforces duality. Griffith is the epitome of this process. He casts away his humanity, becomes a deity, and then descends as a deity in a human body. We don't see any balance between the two, however. He becomes an empty, indifferent idea, an idea of evil, or its manifestation. This concept is strongly connected to the idea of power, which is a highly desirable trait, but not to be gained, but to be construed through pursuit of a meaning by a strong, all-crushing will. In Berserk, if someone's powerless, it's because they don't exercise their will to have a dream to strive for, and so they can't survive being sacrificed, regardless of the nature of their heart. And this is why Griffith is the most attractive force for people like that. Those who are weak, those who desire, those who dream, have one thing in common: inability to manifest their ideals. There's a difference between a dreamer and the one who realizes his dreams. For all these individuals, scarred by life and their own inability to stand up against their fate, including guts before he embarks on his own journey, Griffith is a savior. They share his dream because of their own uselessness. And of course, this is why Griffith feels nothing for them. They're not his equals who pursue a dream of their own. Guts is the positive aspect of the will to power, in a sense. In his overcoming of the evil, he struggles to retain an essentially good heart despite having every reason not to do so, and thus he displays a strong will to power. We clearly see what happens to a world that follows this ideology. The world of Berserk is a world of horrible atrocities and disasters. It's plunged into chaos exactly because there reside people like Griffith, who usher in even the greatest darkness only to make themselves shine. Have we not seen in our own world what happens if an individual casts hundreds, thousands, or even the entire world into annihilation for his dream? His creation, Falconia, is bright on the surface, but it hides demons in its very core, the pandemonium. The answer doesn't lie in synthesis. It lies in the balance between safety and growth. Too much safety leads to totalitarianism, too much growth to anarchy. Nietzsche criticized morality as a weakness and Christianity as an invention of the weak and poor and manifestation of their hatred of the rich or powerful for their own suffering. However, have humans developed consciousness and self-awareness with empathy and morality only to devolve them back into tribal animalism, except this time sprinkled with reason? Does this pursuit of animalistic urges and selfish desires appear as the noblest goal to strive for? Can such an oxymoron, which inevitably leads to, manifest a high ideal? Because in the end, this is what the Superman does when he construes his own values. It's the very thing Griffith does. If we are all doomed to suffer in one way or another, isn't it more difficult and therefore more significant to alleviate someone's suffering, to struggle against the fate of senselessness? Guts is the answer to this problem. Nietzsche knew, though, that Superman is an idea incompatible with human nature. It requires sacrifice of the very core that makes one human for an ideal of pure rationalism. Even Griffith himself, when he was still human, had his doubts sporadically. Guts showed him the beauty of the other side of the coin, a life for living itself. As Nietzsche said, life itself is wholly enough to justify any immensity of suffering. Analysis of Griffith's psyche. As a human, Griffith becomes identified with his persona, that is, the individual personality seen by and used in dealing with the world, which is the one that is of a to-be king. His shadow, the aspect of secret desires and wishes, is projected onto Guts after he leaves, whom Griffith sees as a threat to his dream and internally blames for his misfortunes. This is because Guts provoked the human side to emerge in Griffith, which threatened to take over the consciousness, and that seen by him as in conflict with his dream. To achieve his dream, he willingly chose to tread on others, but he refuses to repent because that would mean acknowledging himself as being the cause of it. The reason is that if Griffith acknowledged his humanity, both his ego and persona built on his dream and held together by repression would shatter, and neurosis would result. That's also why when he emerges as femto and meets quote-unquote God, he sees evil as external and justifies his actions because of fate. This brings us again to the appearance of the false belief that evil disappears once projected outside. For the same reason, he attempts to demonstrate that he is in control of gods. He sees him as his subject, as a possession to be used at will, much like the entire band of the Hawk, but also as a friend that represents the salvation from the alienation caused by the pursuit of his dream, which is still kept alive by his humanity. When, however, God takes the control into his own hands, Griffith's pride is injured and his shadow takes over the consciousness. This process culminates in the eclipse, which is the symbol of the shadow. The sun is the rise of the conscious, the eclipse the rise of the unconscious that overtakes the conscious. There, Griffith becomes his shadow, sacrifices all that made him human, and explicitly shows God that he's the one in control. In a sense, he extracts his true ego personality from a mixture of the traits of the ego personality and those of humanity, morality, and feelings. Or, rather, the desire of his ego takes over and he sacrifices his humanity. After this process, he is reborn as a deity, and the circle of individuation is closed. The thesis and the antithesis are resolved in a synthesis. He thus becomes who he truly is, the embodiment of the negative principle. Just like Christ becomes who he's meant to be and cannot become anything else without ceasing to be Christ, so does the Antichrist. This is also due to the role that fate and causality play in Berserk. Therefore, where God struggles to actually repress his emotions but never fully succeeds to destroy them because of his humanity, Griffith is afflicted by a severe inability to feel any significant connection with anyone or guard any feelings for anyone. And so, he keeps doing what he's always been doing. His alienation is thus exacerbated. All he has left is his dream. As I mentioned before, the transformative power of the evil principle is crucial for the development of the entire story. In the eclipse, God is confronted with his shadow, which sets off his individuation. He has to seek a balance between the beastly thirst for vengeance and an inner need for others. Casca's ego, which identifies with her fantasy, is shattered as the fantasy is dispelled, and Ricketts' process of individuation begins, in turn, with God's. Thus, the evil principle sets up a cascade of events in motion. Mentioning Casca, just as a side remark, I find it actually quite laughable that when Griffith makes a move on her after they rescue him, she hugs him. She misinterprets his thirst for vengeance against God and his desire to re-establish control for him needing her support and decides to stay with him. This is because she's a prisoner of her own fantasy, but that's a topic for another video. It's important to note that the individuation of God is the only true individuation, in the sense that he's on the path to reconcile his shadow and his humanity and bring them into unity within the self. Griffith is in turn swallowed by the illusion he fabricated, and becomes an enantiodromic aspect of cold reason. At the expense of consciousness, room is made for the dream. This disunity and remainder of repression is pointed out by the fact that he shares his body with Moonboy. Moonboy is that repressed humanity. Griffith indeed is the king of longing, because that's all he can do. He longs after his dream, which cannot yet satisfy him, and he longs after what would be without that dream, but he will never cast the dream away either. Thus, on either side, only longing remains. Despite their godlike appearance, the God Hand are not at all omnipotent beings, and neither is the idea of evil. God himself is the very proof that they can be defied. Evil is finite, it holds back a higher development and doesn't accept its boundaries. Logically, it cannot overcome itself unless it wipes itself out of existence. Whereas God embodies a very visceral philosophy, Griffith's is so transcendental that it's completely removed from reality. And maybe, after all, this is the message to the reader. Don't take either of the two as an example to lead your life. Strike the right balance. Beware of what happens when you end on either of the extremes of the spectrum. Be a struggler, aim to survive, but don't make revenge your only drive or it'll consume you. Be a dreamer, pursue your dream despite adversity, but don't let your fantasy be your only guide, or you'll end up cold and alone. Some of you may be asking, why such obsession with a dream? Well, an obsession arises when an aspect of the psyche needs to be reintegrated or reoriented, but the conscious cannot identify which one. A mistaken association is made with a compensatory object that needs to be obtained or an action that has to be performed until the psyche becomes whole again. This, however, never happens unless the underlying unconscious basis of the obsession is appreciated in the conscious. Griffith sees an escape from his alienation that would make him whole, but wouldn't require him to face up to his guilt. He believes that his dream, once realized, will make him complete, even though it's exactly that what he's running from that needs to be accomplished: integration of his humanity. The bat and the falcon. The symbol of the bird represents the masculine, the enlightened, the conscious, and the rational. It symbolizes absolute freedom, but also wisdom and insight. In its extreme, it takes on the form of the sovereignty of cold reason over emotion to such an extent that it gets blinded by itself. As a bird of prey, falcon, it represents cunning, calculation, and relentless pursuit that borders with or becomes an obsession. Bird is also a sign of release of the higher self and a symbol of the soul and spiritual transcendence. Griffith is transformed into the hawk of darkness when his true self is unveiled. It's his victory over his humanity. Hawk is the manifestation of power and inner fire, and a symbol of superiority, strategy, and achievement. As I explained in the first part, Griffith wants to be above everything and is willing to utilize any means necessary to achieve it. And that's also why he asks for wings when transformed into femto and is generally associated with a bird of prey. His eyes follow his target assiduously and with great precision, and they are indeed a great external indicator of what's truly transpiring within. Although Griffith undergoes various changes, his eyes always remain the same empty eyes of a cold-hearted, single-minded hunter. Bat is associated with the dark aspect of the psyche. It's a symbol of the underworld. Even after his outer transformation, on the inside, in his true form, Griffith remains the bat. Note that Griffith is seen as a white hawk by the others, and their understanding is aligned with how the symbol is commonly understood, but it's not what Griffith represents. Even Satan had wings once, after all. Thank you for watching the video. Make sure to give it a thumbs up if you liked it and subscribe to my channel. What do you think about Griffith? How do you think his story will be concluded? Let me know in the comments below.